Okay, greetings and welcome to the 2019-2020 PLP Pathways webinar series. Today is webinar number 2, and we're going to be talking about goals, evidence, and integrated literacy. This work is sponsored by the Middle Grades Collaborative and the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Education. And again, we're working today discussing the goal setting process, how literacy can be integrated into personal learning activities, and the evidence that you should be encouraging your kids to collect to demonstrate their growth and learning. Before we go too much farther, I'd like to introduce or have my colleagues introduce themselves, and that we'll get started. Meg?
Sure. Hi there, I'm Meg O'Donnell. I teach on a 7-8 humanities portion of the RED team at Shelburne Community School.
Hi everybody, my name is Kevin Pioli Hunt. I'm a 5-8 teacher on Swift House at Wilson Central School.
All right, so we're going to start today with a quote from Raz and Hertz about goals. And quote, "Goals can have a powerful impact on how we live our lives. They require us to engage in the entire constellation of stances: empathy, flexibility, persistence, resiliency, and optimism as we set and work towards a specific outcome. Yet perhaps most importantly, they provide our students with an opportunity to develop their own agency and identity in our classrooms." So some questions that we have about goals are: why are they important? How are goals integrated into the personalized learning process? And how can we create an equitable learning environment where all students have the opportunity to set goals and we manage to give students opportunities to achieve those goals and then build on that for academic and life success? So if you think about goals and some reasons you may want to consider setting goals in the classroom, and Kevin and Meg, I'm assuming just from my own practice that most teachers are having kids set goals relative to either academic work or extracurricular work or transferable skills. But some of the reasons you may want to consider or accentuate the goal setting process are that goals get kids to think about possibilities. They give clear direction to work towards. They also give students a clear picture of where they want to go. They can help us push ourselves and get through some of the challenges. They can help us achieve a level of self-discipline that allows us to achieve goals when we're not in a structured setting, such as the classroom learning environment. They can give us motivation and focus, and they are a transferable skill, and they can help us work towards our other, perhaps out of school things that we want to accomplish and we want to achieve. So research has also shown that people who set goals and use them effectively not only perform better, but have less stress and anxiety and are happier and more satisfied with life. And so these are all sort of questions that you may want to consider as you are working with kids setting goals in the classroom. The other thing that I want to mention too, we're really focused this year on integrating equity into this process, the personalized learning process. And how do we respond? This is from Gorski's Equity Literacy Framework. And how do teachers respond in a way that cultivates in students the ability to sort of figure out, their inequities or challenges that they have? And how do we give all kids the opportunity to set goals that are meaningful, that apply to their lives and their situations? And how do we then provide the support so that they can achieve those? The inequality in performance and life outcomes between groups who differ in gender, race, and ethnicity and socioeconomic status is obviously an issue that public schools are dealing with. And again, if we think about equity, we think about goals, and we think about where kids want to go in their life and learning process, how can we as teachers support that? So Meg is going to consider, well, actually, let me step back for a second. One question to consider when goal setting: how might enhanced goals directed conceptualization and action among all of our students, particularly those who have been marginalized, ensure that all people have access to the support and resources to achieve their goals? So just again, thinking about it, in a larger sense, how are we working with kids to set goals? Why are goals important? And how do we ensure that all of our students, no matter their background, their race, ethnicity, gender, etc., how do we ensure that all of them feel comfortable setting goals and have the supports available to them? And before we get to the next sort of process or part of the webinar, I'd like perhaps Meg and Kevin to discuss what goal setting, if you can summarize maybe what goal setting looks like in your classroom, and just give the real bullet points of who, what, when, where, and maybe a little bit about the why. And thanks again for joining us. And Kevin, what does goal setting look like at Swift House?
Yeah, so our PLPs and the student goals are really at the foundation, the heart of what we do. So for us, it's extremely important because it drives our student-led conferences. It drives pretty much everything that these kids are doing on a week-to-week basis. So in terms of your bullet points, going through that at the beginning of every year, so our fifth graders come in early for the Hopes and Dreams Conference, and we meet with the fifth graders and their parents. And ahead of time, we send out a student profile form for them to think about and fill out at home. And that's just the getting to know you page about, what are some hobbies and interests and things like that. And then on the other side of that, we explain our PLP process, and we have them write down their strengths and challenges in the 5 different transferable skill areas, because we have 5 goals for each of our students, and it's 1 for each transferable skill area. So on that document, we write it out so it's student-friendly language, so the kids know, if we're talking about communication, really, what are your strengths around reading, writing, speaking, listening, and what are your challenges around those areas? So they come in, and again, we just work as a team with the parents or guardians, the student, the teacher, talking about these different areas. And then what's great is it always comes back to the student, and they decide, do you want to build on a strength, or do you want to work on an area that's a challenge for you? And we just keep peeling back the layers. If a kid's saying, I want to be a really good writer, like that's a great goal. Now let's peel that back and say, what kind of habits do you need to do to become a really good writer? And that's where our goals typically land, in the habits phase, where it's, I take time to revise my writing when I'm done, or I ask a peer to check over my writing, or I look for grammar usage and mechanics when I'm doing a writing assignment. So those are the things that land as the goal, versus just kind of this bigger, I want to be a good writer. So we always kind of peel that back and say, okay, what does it take for that to happen? And for our 6th or 8th graders, we have just our goal setting. They come in with the PLP goals that they finished the previous year with, and then we meet with them throughout, September, October. I just finished up my last one this past week, and it's just a check-in to see, here's where you finished the end of the year last year. How do you feel about your goals? Do you want to change anything? Do they still make sense to you? Do you still want to reflect on a weekly basis about these? Is it helping? And again, it comes back to where the students advocate for themselves as to whether or not they want to keep them, which is, to me, where I think the equitable piece comes in. Is it all comes back to the student voice, and it's us just listening to the students and what they see as important. And what's great too with using the transferable skills is it transfers to all areas of their life. So we're often pushing students, find evidence of this in your classes, and then find evidence outside of school. And more times than not, they have no problem finding, evidences from their different content area classes, and evidence from, their music that they're doing, or their sports practices, or their games. And that's where you can really see it take form. So I guess that's the who and the when.
So just real quick, so you set goals with your 5th graders individually, or is this a whole class activity?
Nope, so that's individually. So each one of so there's 4 core teachers and about 92 students. So we each have roughly 6 to 7 new 5th graders every year per core. So before the first day of school, we have Hopes and Dreams conferences with our individual 5th grade families. They come in. And again, whenever we conference with kids, and this could be goal setting or just our typical student-led conference, it takes about 30 to 45 minutes. And that's just one thing that we've committed to as a team. We're not comped or anything for that. It's just we recognize that that's important, and that's what drives what we do. So we make the time to come in before school starts and have that first meet and greet with the student, and then we start discussing goals. It's not super formal. If we don't land on a goal during that first conference, it's fine. We have plenty of time to work into it. But it does allow us to start at least a conversation going. And I think having that conversation from the start also shows the families that, this is what we value. We don't really sit here talking about, here's how we're going to assess you and score you on stuff. We talk about what are some things you want to get better at and continue to improve on. And that's what we're going to take to heart. Not that the other stuff's not important, of course, but we really value this PLP process and personalization for kids.
I just have one other question for you. So you mentioned landing on a goal. How many goals do you, I have two questions actually. How many goals do you have kids set? And then my the next question would be, how do other teachers who may not have those new students in their core class, how do they become aware of the goals that their students have?
Great questions. So the first one, we have each of our students set 5 goals. And so it's one for each transferable skill area. So an example, like one of my 6th graders, for communication, she really wanted to work on speaking in class, and she wants to get better at just kind of sharing her voice in class. So we talked about what that would look like, and the goal we landed on for her was I regularly raise my hand and share my thinking in class. So week to week, she can think about how she's doing with that. By the end of the trimester, we're thinking about how she's reflecting on that and finding evidences. For problem solving, that's a lot of times kids have goals around using a growth mindset or persevering when they're stuck or hit an obstacle. Self-direction, that's where your time management, organization, prioritizing comes in. So so all of our students have 5 goals, and they range in grade size for sure. But again, it's something we get to the point where the goals are something that are going to be able to at least last a trimester, but aren't unobtainable. So we're hoping that, again, 2 or 3 trimesters in for sure, by the end of the year, students should feel really good about the growth that they've made and that they're clearly making progress based on the evidences that they're showing. We're, as a team, so close, and we see these kids in so many different capacities. So more times than not, if something comes up, we might just ask, hey, does so-and-so have a goal around this? Because they're really working hard. And we're always just encouraging each other or reminding each other to always bring up, hey, everybody just persevered really well today in math class. If you have a goal around perseverance, this would be a great opportunity to put this in for evidence. Or everybody just was on task and working really well and collaborating. So if you have any collaboration goals, make sure you put this in your PLP. And since we're all doing this, that's very common and easy for us to do. The tricky part, and one thing that we've been working on as a school, is really getting this information more seamless to the essential arts teachers and the world language teachers, and getting them more on board. Also knowing that they're seeing the entire student body, not just our 90 kids. So for them, it's we have to take a step back too and realize that would be asking them to know the PLPs of 500 to 600 students, which isn't a fair thing to do. But so we're still working on logistical systems within our setting to best suit their needs and make it a more seamless process.
Okay, thanks. So Meg, same question to you. The who, what, why, when, and where of goals, and what does that look like in your program, and where are you in that process this year?
Right. So this year, as we're on a new team, we're trying to figure out a couple of systems in place to help kids to sort of normalize the process and help kids figure out where they're at. So the first thing we started with at the beginning of the year was tracking their reading. We just tried to use reading as a model of thinking about if we were going to use reading as a goal setting practice, how do we start that? So we started with gathering some evidence. And so what we did the first couple of weeks of school is we just had kids track simply whether, and I know this is you can't really see this, but it was a table where they were tracking all right, how many either minutes are you reading or pages are you reading? They had a system for tracking that. So every morning they'd come into Prime Group and do that. And then they started to chart their progress. And again, starting to look at habits. What do you notice about yourself as a reader? What are your strengths as a reader? What do you think gets in the way of you maintaining that? So while I had some students that were really great about reading all the time, some kids were, oh my gosh, I didn't get a chance to read, or I forgot my book at home, or sorry about that. Sorry. They were just kind of trying to do some self-reflection around who am I as a reader? And just this week, we pushed out to them. We've gathered this information now for a couple of weeks. What do you notice? Who are you? And what is a goal that makes sense for you related to reading? And for some students, we've also been talking a lot about, we did an audit on who are the characters that we read about and who are the authors that we read. So I stole that a task, I think, from Kyle Chadburn on his identity site, but it's basically asking kids to think about what are the age and the genders and the race of the characters that you read about and the authors that you read. And that was a really interesting conversation as well. Some kids think a lot about reading diverse books and about books from other cultures and characters that don't look like them. And then we had students that realized, I only read books about teenage girls. I don't branch out of that. So that was a natural liaison, like a natural step for students to then start saying, I think I want to really broaden my authors, or I want to broaden the characters that I read about. For some kids, they're still in something as just, hey, I just want to devote more time to reading. I clearly don't make it a priority, and I notice that I need to do that. So we do have a system, I don't have a copy of it in front of me, but where it's basically, here's the goal, and what are 2 or 3 action steps that you need to take to achieve that goal? And what evidence are you going to gather to be able to show that progress? And that's tricky for kids. Sometimes they don't, again, it's sort of that forward thinking, like, I know I will be successful with this goal because I will have a richer, a more diverse set of books that I've read. Or it might be, I noticed that I've been reading a half an hour every night at home, and I'm rewarding myself with that, or I'm incentivizing it, or and I will have read more books as a result of reading more every day at home. So we're trying to help them think through the evidence part of it. How will you know that you've been successful? So this process of reading is hopefully setting them up for. I don't know if have you copyrighted the Hopes and Dreams tag? Because we stole it, and our conferences are over the next like 2 weeks, couple of weeks. And basically we're now having them do some reflection around just who they, I'm proud of something. This is something I'm proud of, or I feel accomplished in this area. This is something that I still find challenging. So it's way broader. And we're gonna, again, model that same process of, right, so at the conference, our hope at the conference is to set a goal with parents and kids and say, all right, let's tackle this one area. What are the action steps? How will you know that you've been successful in that? I think the only thing I want to just note, and it was because I just had a conversation with a kid today about compliance. Mm-hmm. And she said to me, what do you want my reading evidence to look like? And I said, well, I don't know. What do you want it to look like? And she said, well, I want to remember the books that I read better because I tend to read them and then I forget about them. So I want to find a way to reflect on them better. And I said, great. And she said, so do you want me to reflect after each chapter? And I was like, wow, that feels really tedious. Like that feels like a lot of work. Is that going to serve you? And if that serves you, great. But if it's not, then let's free yourself up to just reflect when it makes sense. Or, if you haven't been, let's check it over the next couple of days that you read and find out when does it make sense for you to reflect. And I just bring that up because I think sometimes kids, it's clear to me that kids often get stuck in that compliance mode. What do you want? What do you want me to show? What do you want me to do with this? How will you assess me on this? And it's like, whoa, this is this is really intended to be a personal goal for you. So that was just an important reminder for me about establishing the culture with kids around making goals meaningful for them, as opposed to this is a compliance. This is something I have to do.
Thank you very much. I know that Maura, and Maura, do you want to introduce yourself? Thanks for joining us.
Yes, hi, I'm Maura Wheeler. I'm the proficiency-based learning and technology integration coach at the Lamoille South School District. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm running from a conference and logging in, but thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. I think that we were saying before the webinar started that everybody, it feels like they're running around. I think it's that time of year when we're all kind of getting up to speed. I know that we are going to talk a little bit more about what it looks like in the classroom with Maura in just a second, but Meg, do you want to talk a little bit more also about this evidence and integrated learning? And you mentioned at the end of your discussion there about what you're doing now, you talked about motivation and goal setting, you know, rather than compliance. You want kids in the habit of setting a good goal. And before you answer this question, I also just want to point out, as usual, I'm taking notes and I'm noticing common language. I'm noticing this these habits of learning that you're talking about. And I also noticed the engagement. There's a lot of talk about engagement and the habits, and then this idea of noticing, right? You're having students notice things about their own behaviors. And to me, that's directly, you know, obviously linked to reflection. And so I just, you know, as we begin this conversation about how goals can be integrated with literacy, and, you know, I'm just paying attention to that common language you're using. And it also is noteworthy that both you and Kevin are in the same school district, right?
Yes.
So maybe, I don't know if that's a district-wide thing but that importance of common language. And I also, back to what Kevin was saying in his introduction, he was mentioning how all of the teachers on his team are sort of on the same page when it comes to language and the transferable skills, and how it's easier for them to have kids pull evidence because of that common language. So just some things I'm noticing, you know, common language, noticing or reflecting, and how these are important parts of the goal setting process. But enough with that. Meg, do you want to just talk a little bit about the integrated literacy?
Sure. I think I was just going to say what Kevin had shared at the beginning, but that idea that when students notice, even if our systems don't allow for integration, when we do benefit from coming from a district that has transferable skills, that has learning targets related to the transferable skills, that has a whole section devoted just to self-direction. So by having that common language and having teachers talk about learning targets and learning scales that help kids achieve, you know, work towards what does it mean to be a self-directed learner, that empowers teachers, I think, to embed that into their classroom. So even if you're in a silo of teaching science, you can still talk to kids about how are you managing your time? How are you keeping track of your assignments? What does that look like? And how can we support you in that? Because if you're struggling to maintain your notebook or whatever in science, more than likely that might be true for the humanities or your other classes. So definitely a common language, I think, helps that. And I love, Kevin, the way you described your teachers helping kids be metacognitive in the moment in the classroom. Hey, did you notice that you guys were just persevering through the stuck point? Did you notice that when you turn and talk that you are conferring with one another? You're building community just by doing that. Whatever the purpose of the metacognition is in that moment, is helping kids not only see it in themselves, but I think they see it in one another. So again, that fosters the community of like, hey, we're sort of all in this together. And I think those are real motivators. I think that I'm sorry, hang on 1 second. Sorry about that. That late bus always kills it. But I think when kids start to see each other as we're in this work together as partners in the work, and that reminds me of establishing some sort of partners. I did establish reading partners with my students at the beginning of the year to help support them in this goal setting around reading, and having a buddy, I think, is also a motivator. It just helps them to realize that, you know, all of us have stuck points, whether the stuck point is related to the amount of time that I read or the types of books that I read, whatever it is. And as we move forward with broader goals or bigger goals, I think that's going to help establish that support.
So I have just a quick follow-up question.
Sure.
Motivation and goal setting seem to be pretty important. And I'm wondering if maybe Maura and Kevin could weigh in about how you view motivation and tied to young adolescents. And also, you know, this to me is also sort of an equity issue too. Like, how do you get kids to understand the importance of goals who might not have the experience of them, or who, like, how do we address issues of equity when it comes to motivating? You know, it's not just, come on, let's do it, but how do those things tie together? And, you know, what does it look like in your classroom, or when, Maura, you work with teachers?
As Meg was talking, as I was thinking earlier today about our topic of goal setting, I was reminded of the way that Daniel Pink talks about motivation, about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And I think as middle level educators, that's sort of central to what we do every day. Thinking about giving our students autonomy and choice, and partnering with them, that there's purpose behind what we're doing, and that the students with the mastery, it's really being able to sort of master those skills. And I think that's where the common language comes in. Unless you're naming something and noticing something, we have to do that in partner with our students to help them know that they can achieve it, and through reflecting with our students, that's helpful. But it's really about the combination of those three elements, and that if one is lacking, that's where we fall into, as Meg was talking about, like the compliance piece. It's not about, the purpose is not, you know, for the reward of a grade or because of, you know, you know, the compliance piece of it, but really thinking about how are we creating deep meaning and purposeful opportunities for our students. And in the goal setting conversation, that's really where those conversations are happening. And when we're in conference with our students, helping them select their goals, those are the pieces to look at. And so, so as Meg was talking, and then as you're asking about motivation and sort of what does that look like, those are sort of the three pieces that I always sort of come back to.
I like this, that naming and noticing. I think that's kind of catchy. And I'm wondering if we can, you know, I could introduce that to my students and say, hey, these are some of the things that we're naming, and can you be noticing them? Kevin, do you have thoughts about the motivation piece?
Yeah, you know, in a perfect world, obviously we get our students to sit back and see it the way we do and say, oh, wow, I'm, you know, learning how to set goals and reflect and be better. Yeah. And this is really going to pay off for me when I'm going into the workplace or into college and afterwards. So that's the dream. The reality is, oh my gosh, this is so much work. Why do we have to do this? And that's some of the feedback we get sometimes. But I think a big thing and for us that helps is that it's completely driven by the student. You know, we're at no point in the game are we telling the student what a goal is going to be or telling a student what they're going to use for evidence. And I think just that ownership, especially at this, you know, for us, we're 5th through 8th grade, where kids again, I always come back to this kind of fine balance of they need structure, they crave independence, and how are we meeting them in that common ground there? And I think it gives it to them because we're providing the structure within just having the communication with them, kind of coaching them through it, and asking the genuine questions, but they're coming up with what they want. This is what I want for a goal. This is the piece of evidence I'm going to use to show growth on this goal. This is why it matters to me. And I think that's where the power and the motivation comes in. And then more of an external motivator for us is their PLPs are what drives their student conferences. So after we have these kids for just one trimester, the fifth graders start to see, okay, there's a ton of weight on this PLP. Like, it's not graded, it's not scored, it's not assessed in any way, but when it comes time for those 30 to 45-minute conferences, I'm sitting there with my parents or guardians or family members, whoever's there with me, and my teacher. I'm going over every one of my goals, talking about my evidence, and talking about what did I do that was successful, what do I still need to work on, if I want to keep the goal or not, advocating for myself. And that's where I think a level of seriousness comes to it too, is we're like, okay, like this really matters. And that to me is a good feeling too, that it's not something like, it's not a grade that's driving it, but it's just I think when the students are seeing that we're putting a lot of value in this and recognizing it, and then they're seeing that show up in their conferences, that we're talking about the PLP and not about the report card, then all of a sudden their minds shift from I'm just worried about what score am I getting on my whatever, where we use jump rope on my reporting system, versus am I making progress on my goals. And I think what a lot of teams and other schools run into is the flip of that, where teachers put so much emphasis on here's the scores you got when they have conferences, and we have 10 minutes left or 5 minutes left, let's just talk how you doing on your goals, making progress, great, all right, we'll see you next time. And I think that then trickles down to show, okay, we value this assessment piece and this more compensation piece, versus we value the goal setting piece and the communication about your growth as a learner and as an individual. So I think a lot of that does fall on the teacher's shoulders in terms of what are we emphasizing when we're working with these kids, and that'll lead to the motivation piece.
Kev, I wonder if I could just piggyback on that a little bit about, because it's got me thinking about times when the goal setting process is like beautiful, and it just follows that progression. You sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier about, so what happens when it doesn't? And one of the things I was wondering about related to that was, do you have a bank or examples of what makes like the strongest goals, or the goals that really foster that sense of learning and empowerment for the kids? Do you have, not really a hierarchy, but do you have some ideas about what those really strong goals look like?
Well, and we do, and that's another thing that we actually send home in the summertime when parents are starting to think about goals, is we have a goal bank, and it's just examples of goals other kids have used. And we use that more as like, look, if this goal works for you, great, use it. And if nothing else, maybe it'll help get the wheels turning in terms of what a goal can look like. Mm-hmm. So we have a goal bank for each of the transferable skill areas. And the big, like, I feel like it's not really a hierarchy in terms of, because it's going to be so different for every kid in terms of what's the right goal. But for me, like, I know we have a good goal, when I ask the kid after we land on a goal, and I ask the student, all right, what does evidence like that, what's that look like for you? Finding evidence. Yeah. And they're able to say, I could use this from this class, or I could use this from my practice, or I could use this from when I'm home and cleaning up my room. And that, to me, when they can like rattle off these ideas for how can I find evidence of growth for this, that to me means we have a really great goal in mind. Versus when I ask, hey, so what kind of evidence, what's that going to look like for you? And they're like, I have no idea. So that we need to go back to the drawing board a little bit. So I don't feel like there's like a one simple answer for that, but
no, but I think you did hit it with like, when the student can future see the success, like I can picture in my mind what this looks like, then that makes for a strong goal. Because right then and there, that they've owned it, right? And it isn't, like you said, something that was imposed or something that, you know, I remember doing this with kids when the parents were pushing on a goal, and it was like, well, look, if you know, mom and dad, you and I agree that this is a good goal for your kiddo, but if your kiddo isn't going to make this happen, or it doesn't feel like it's theirs, then we've set them up for failure. You know, we've set them up to not succeed. Which kind of brings me to another follow-up question, which is why, like, what does the celebrating, or why is the celebrating of goal setting so important? And anybody can answer this, but why? What does the celebration of goal setting look like, and why is it so critical to this process? Anyone can chime in on that.
I think for me, it's connected to what Kevin was sharing about, and what you were saying a little bit, Meg, too, about, you know, I think when we ask our students to set goals, we also need them to be the voice that identifies what it looks like when they're successful. Like, they are the ones that are kind of visualizing that criteria for success, if you will. And I think it was always something that I struggled with, was, and it comes back to the noticing, because your students aren't all going to meet their goals at the same time, or we're not going to be all ready to celebrate at the same time, is finding those like individual moments to, you know, talk about students' goals and to notice with them the small milestones. Because I think that's the other thing that can happen, is that, you know, if we just talk about them at our goal setting meeting and then we have our weekly reflections or something like that, we miss the opportunities. And if we're not paying attention to it with our students, you know, and if we're not creating those spaces to think about them all the time, we miss it. And I think that's so typical of humans. How many people have set a New Year's resolution and then they're like, oh, this is so much work and I'm not seeing any results, forget it. And, you know, 3 weeks in, no one's at the gym and all the equipment is empty again. You know what I mean? And so how are we noticing the small growth? And that is so challenging to orchestrate, but that's how the momentum stays. And that's where goals buddies can be really successful, and using peer-to-peer sort of opportunities to celebrate with each other. Yeah, those are sort of like what's going through my head right now.
I just also want to add, as Maura's talking about this peer-to-peer opportunities, and I'm thinking about some of my 8th grade boys and what that would look like if they're talking about their goals. And then I just went immediately to, if you do it unstructured and unscripted, it might end up a little chaotic. But what a great opportunity to use scripts and communication standards to say, hey, we're going to have a scripted discussion about your goals. And you could do all the preparation, and then you could have the speaking and listening part, and you could have constructive responses. And all of a sudden when we talk about integrated literacy, this becomes a 2 or maybe 3 day lesson, a package, where, you know, you set up a structured conversation, you have the kids introducing goals, and you can incorporate the kids. What do you feel comfortable talking about? And you can incorporate their voice, literally and figuratively, into structuring that script. And then you give them this idea of a goal bank is excellent. And I also like the idea you give them a bank of things that they can be saying to each other, and pick and choose and develop those conversations, so that eventually when you remove those supports, they can have a meaningful, structured conversation, where we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, this idea of empathy. They can be practicing empathy and also problem solving within that goal setting conversation. So I think, you know, those celebrations I think are really important when it's peer to peer. And I think a lot of our kids as young adolescents are reluctant sometimes to share those. And so having the opportunity, structuring that sharing can be a great way of removing some of that anxiety from kids. But the other thing too is, you know, we had kids attend that climate strike recently in Montpelier. And I asked them, I said, oh, you should go take pictures and you should do a little bit of reporting on that. And they came back and they put together a little slideshow of their experience. I had them present that, and the whole time your positive feedback. This is outstanding. This is just what we're looking for. This is the type of thing, if you're doing something interesting, you should be putting together a little slideshow, whatever. But that type of encouragement, I think, goes a long way to help other kids see the successes. I do worry, as we mentioned before, whether or not that's equitable for all students, right? Do all students get that opportunity? But I do think that this idea of celebrating the small steps is really important for kids, and teacher-led and student-led. How can we be thoughtful about doing that so that kids realize that they are making progress and feeling good about the work that they're doing in class?
I know that one of the things we're anticipating once through the goal setting is through their Friday emails is having kids acknowledge any progress towards their action steps as they're happening in their Friday emails. So a prompt for a week in the Friday email might be like, hey, let's update us. Where are you at? How's it going? And I also think it's so important to empower kids to ask for help and to ask, like, what do you need? You're not in this alone. We're here to support you. And a lot of times I think they think that that they might have to figure it out by themselves. And I don't know if that's a cultural thing as well. Like just trying to, Kev, I'm building on some of the conversations we've been having on this equity course, but sometimes in some households, maybe asking for help, there isn't that same opportunity, or it's looked down upon, or maybe it's just not part of the culture of the houses. And so how do we let kids know that you have to be able to ask for help and recognize that it's okay to do that. In fact, it's critical, like it's essential. So I think, Don, that makes me think about that idea of those partners, whether it's scripted up on the front end of the conversation of how are you going to achieve those goals, but having those conversations midpoint as well to say, what are your stuck points, and what do we need to retool or refine so that we can help you feel successful about it.
I love that you brought that up about asking for help and thinking about like as a teacher, how are we modeling that through our talk alouds for kids? And like as we're asking students to set goals, are we transparent about the goals that we're setting for ourselves when it's appropriate, but then also sharing with students when we're struggling or we're stuck or I'm questioning if it's the right goal? Because that's, I think a lot of that we're doing, but we're not always saying it aloud to our students. And I think that's, I think it can normalize it a little bit more.
Right, because I don't think that like as you mentioned, goal setting is messy, right? It's not like, oh, I'm gonna nail the language and I'm gonna nail the action steps and I'm gonna, sometimes it works out that way, but sometimes, more often than not, it's like, well, I thought this was gonna be my goal, but I ended up really finding that I needed more support or more, I found myself acknowledging more success over here with this. And so is it okay to retool it or to modify it?
I'm taking a lot of notes. There's a lot of good stuff here, and I appreciate it. Maura, do you want to take us into the next section? I think this is going to be, it's 4:15, and I think this will be the last part of the webinar. I do at the end want to just identify some of the resources and events that are happening, and also encourage people to share anything that they're aware of that's going on that might support our teachers out in the field. Maura, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of like classroom level practices, but I'm wondering, thinking about a lot of the transferable skills like self-direction. A lot of schools have growth mindset as a skill. Like how are you thinking about in this process incorporating intentional instruction around these in conjunction with the goal setting?
So I can just start with that because as I was mentioning previously, I'm a little late on the goal setting. We're actually going to start that process probably next week. And I'm actually happy that we had this conversation today because that's going to help me quite a bit. But I actually spend 3 or 4 days of my language arts class talking about goals. And we touch on things like what makes a good goal, what makes a not so good goal. But we also bring into play ideas about persistence and growth mindset. And I show them videos about growth mindset. We talk a little bit about grit. We also talk a little bit about why goals are important. And we have kids brainstorm different goals. I really like this idea of a goal bank so that I can start showing them examples. But I have a pretty it's a pretty big presentation about goals, but it incorporates all these other elements of mindset and motivation into it. And I'm really explicit about instructing about goals because I find that if you do it once the right way, or once in a way that kids understand it, that from that point on, you don't have to spend nearly as much time on it. And so you teach it once really deeply and really well, and then use exemplars and have kids become partners in helping you understand that goal setting process. And then it becomes much easier down the road to have kids set goals independently. Kevin or Meg?
Yeah, in terms of growth mindset, our students are flooded with growth mindset, mostly through math. I think as early as kindergarten in our district anyway, they put so much emphasis through our math committees, using Joe Bowler's resources. And if you're not familiar with Joe Bowler, I would definitely check her out. And it's just, yeah, the growth mindset piece is now starting, I think the past couple of years especially, going to get more integrated through the different content areas where it's not just math using that language, but it's literally every single thing we're doing with these students and talking about, what is a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, and what's it look like to persevere when we're stuck. So in terms of the explicit teaching that you were talking about more, I think a lot of that comes through in our content level classes. And then I've been thinking too about like a self-direction piece. I have a kid who's talking about, I can, has a goal around time management or prioritizing their assignments or their tasks, or, just being, mindful of who's in the space with them. And I've been thinking a lot about this, all right, you have this goal, which is great, and you can identify what evidence is going to look like, but who's teaching you these skills? And we've talked about that a little bit too as a team, just, where should we, make the time in our days with our students to be teaching these skills? And is it something that's really a formal lesson, or is it more just kind of the conversation with them, just talking about it? And we've found that we have a common core time where all of our 5th graders are in. So year in and year out, we try to do a lot of that teaching with our 5th graders when they come. So hopefully it kind of just sticks as they go on. And then by the time they become mentors to 7th and 8th graders, the mentors are relaying those messages to the 5th graders, which is really helpful too. But I think that's a great question. Something that I feel like is a big area of growth for us too, is being more explicit around teaching, those self-direction citizenship skills, because kids come up with great goals, but maybe they don't have an opportunity to learn, like, well, what does that look like? How do I actually organize my planner and help me prioritize my assignment? And that's something that we need to make sure we're paying attention to.
Right. Like it shouldn't be a surprise, right? Like it shouldn't be, self, I don't know, like, I think sometimes we talk about kids about some of these ideas about perseverance or time management, they think they know the term, but then when you start talking about what does that really look like, they're like, oh, I didn't realize I was supposed to have an assignment book or whatever, or I should use my folder to maintain my stuff. So we do have a prime group time every day, which is when we're not in core time, where I have my 20 kids, and I've been using that time as a way to just introduce one of these, maybe it's task initiation. So what does that look like? And so for the rest of this week, I want you to just pay attention to that. You know, how do you get started on a task? Are you like me and you procrastinate and you make a bunch of piles, but you don't really do the work? And so how do you like dive into the work, and how do you use your time to support that? So I try to throw myself under the bus as often as I can, because it's true. Like I'm not always great about, you know, managing my time or prioritizing what I need to do. And I find that when I start to pay it, when I'm doing it with kids, we can talk about it openly, because I'm right there with them. I'm right there with them, making the mistakes.
Do we have time for one more, Don, or?
It's 4:20. Does anybody have any last comments, or Maura, is there something in that list that you think is important? I do think that talking about families is really important.
That was the next one.
So Maura, do you want to go with that?
Yeah, so I'm curious to know from sort of within your classroom context, how are families included in the goal setting process? What does that look like? And why should we, you know, like, what is the reason behind incorporating families into this process?
I can start with that a little bit if you want, or Don.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So we have intentionally, we've been modeling the reading goal setting process just here at school, but the Hopes and Dreams, the conference that's coming up in the next couple of weeks, we have left the goal setting and action step part as part of the actual conference. I don't know how in depth we'll get. We'll see how it goes with the parents' comfort level. I think something I'm a little curious about is how will parents receive that? I don't know historically how they've been involved in goal setting when students were on the other teams. And I'm also conscious of some cultural practices that may make goal setting uncomfortable for family. You know, I just want to be aware of who's coming in to the conversation, and making sure that I'm using sensitive language around it. I just want to be mindful of that, to not assume that future thinking, that the future that I think for my students and the future that families have for their kids necessarily align, or that we're always coming from the same page. So I'm just mindful of that. But we're going to try it at the conference, and I think a key part of that is just that we only see these kids for this chunk of the day, and knowing that when a child knows that mom and dad and their teacher, that we're all on the same page in support of them, means so much more likelihood that that this is gonna that I have a better chance of achieving these goals, or certainly making progress towards them.
Yeah, I just think that, so we have the kids set the goals, and I'm thinking about how can you share that, either, you know, we have that email, or sending a hard copy home and having the family sign off on that. But I also always go back to something that Lindsay Hallman, who was busy today and couldn't join us, says about this partnership between school, the student, and the family, and how important it is to make sure that that sort of pyramid of strength is always reinforced. And I really like the idea of having the kids set the goals, but then, as Kevin was alluding to, using the PLP and the student-led conference. So I don't think that the goals, the family shouldn't see the goals for the first time at that conference, right? So how do we make it so that if they come in and they want to make a suggestion about the goal, they have the opportunity to do that? But I also really like this idea that Meg just talked about, and we come back to language. Are we using language that's accessible to all of our students, and all families understand sort of what's at stake with the goal setting? And how do we make sure that all families understand the process, and that they also know what's a good goal and what's not a good goal, and then can help their students with that? So I don't have a clear answer. I do believe, though, that sharing those goals prior to that conference is really critical, and also making sure that students, as Meg mentioned, know that we're sharing this with the family in the hopes that kids can be successful. That's what it all boils down to, is that we want kids to be successful and to be independent and able to do this when we're not around. And so how do we get everybody on board supporting them?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off what you both said, when we're setting goals, we make sure that the families are at the table for those reasons, just to show that community piece. And, whenever our kids make a goal, I always look at, the students' guardians and who's with them and say, does this feel good for everybody? And just that check and that communication. And what I've noticed too is it's a great opportunity for us to almost facilitate and allow our students to advocate for themselves and teach them how to advocate respectfully to their parents for something that they want. Because I think sometimes, in certain households, maybe that kid doesn't really have much of a voice or get much of a say in what he or she does. And, this gives them that opportunity where, at that time, I feel like the teacher does have that social capital. If we use that to help our students say, okay, now you have ownership here and you have a voice in this whole matter, and this is about you. Because a lot of times we have parents saying, oh, they need to work on this, this is a big thing for them. I don't just say, yep, you're right. I say, all right, well, Johnny, what do you think about that? And if you don't disagree, that's okay. Like, just tell us why. And I think it just allows for that conversation to happen where I can disagree with you and advocate for something that I want, but in a respectful way. And I think it's important for the kids to have that practice, especially, 10 to 13-year-olds. That's what a time for them to learn how to respectfully talk to their parents, I think.
Right.
So that's outstanding information. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody and discuss this. One thing before we talk about some important events that are happening, I do want to mention, just to tag on to what Kevin was saying, that our next PLP Pathways webinar is Thursday, November 14th, and we will be talking about family engagement. So this topic of how we're sharing information, goals, and otherwise with families will certainly come up. And hopefully we'll hear some innovative ways that people are engaging with families to make sure that they stay connected to school. Real quick, if we can start with Maura, Meg, and Kevin, are there learning opportunities or events or resources that you're paying particular attention to that you want to that you want to recommend?
I'm actually going to take one that's on the list, but the Vermont Higher Ed Collaborative has a series from equity awareness to equity action. One was yesterday, and the next one coming up, and I don't have the date, but it's on gender in schools, I believe. And along with those conferences, they also had a series of 3 free webinars that you could download. So I'll send those along to put in the follow-up email if they're still available, because I found sometimes it's hard to get out of the building to go to a conference, but that was a really nice free resource.
Okay, and if there are videos, if there's a way that we can post them on our YouTube channel, that also would be awesome. Meg?
Well, just that on November 14th here at Shelburne is the next family board meeting, in which we'll be talking about upgrading or like updating the middle school is not a building resource, and looking at how to make that more accessible to teachers and a little bit more user-friendly. And so, so that'll be part of it. And I just wanted to just put one little thing in about, I did attend the VPA conference last week on equity, on cultivating equity. It was incredible. It was up at Jay Peak. It was just a great opportunity, especially for me from Chittenden County, to be up in the Northeast and get a window into the conversations. And it was led by kids, and it was just a really powerful, important conversation. I felt lucky to be there. And I think there's some other ones coming up. I was just trying to get on the website to see when the next ones are, but if you can get a chance to check that out, it was great.
Kev?
One that's definitely on our radar is the Youth Environmental Summit. We're bringing a team to that. It's coming up on November 1st, and it's going to be our first time attending. So I think we'll have a group of about 12 students going to that. And the other one that just came across from our principal today was about the Youth Climate Congress. And it looks like some youth are, this is brand new to me, so I'm just reading it here, are essentially building on the climate strike and trying to organize representatives from each school, middle school, high school, college around Vermont to get to the state capitol and make a statement about eliminating fossil fuel use. And that's Monday, November 17th is when it's happening. And I'm assuming there's going to be more information posted about that as we go.
Awesome. I have a couple resources. One is, this is the last Audubon magazine, and this is all about climate action. And they actually have a climate action plan. And that climate action plan dovetails with some of the stuff that we're doing in our class. For example, they have a link to climate stories. So if we're talking about integrated literacy, you can have kids write stories about how climate's impacting their neighborhood. That's a good one. Also, the YES conference, again, I think is really good. And then two other resources that are electronic. Jeannie Phillips has a middle grades competencies framework that's aligned with Paul Gorski's equity literacy framework, which I think is a really great, it's just a great resource to have. And look how our middle grades practice should be, or can be aligned and should be aligned with Gorski's equity literacy framework. And then I mentioned it at the beginning of the webinar, but we're doing a lot with social justice and the teaching tolerance. Their lesson plans and resources are really great. And they're easy to access, easy to use, understandable. And so that's just something out there for folks to think about. I'd like to close by thanking everybody for joining us again, Kevin, Meg, and Maura. Really appreciate it. We are in the process of scheduling our consultations with teachers in the field. I also want to point out that if you watch this webinar, the word of the webinar is goals. And you can get an hour of professional development credit by watching and completing a short survey of your learning. That's all posted on PLP Pathways, which we'll put up on Twitter and we'll have on our mailing list. Again, this work is sponsored by the Middle Grades Collaborative and the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Technology. We deeply appreciate everybody out there who's working hard, making sure that students, families, and everyone is engaged and learning. And thank you very much, everybody. Have a great evening and enjoy the weekend. Take care. Thank you.